I knew something was wrong the moment the hospital went quiet, because hospitals in Chicago never go quiet, not at 2:17 a.m., not under fluorescent lights that hum like tired insects, not when machines keep people alive in steady mechanical rhythms, but that night even the monitors seemed to soften their beeping like they were holding their breath, and I remember standing behind the nurse's station, one hand pressed lightly against the curve of my stomach, feeling the small reassuring movement beneath my scrubs, reminding myself that no matter how long the shift got, no matter how heavy my feet felt, I had a reason to keep going. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 26 years old, 6 months pregnant, and running on 3 hours of sleep and vending machine coffee, but I was still smiling because that's what patients needed. They didn't need to see fear, they didn't need to see exhaustion, they needed someone steady, someone kind, someone who wouldn't break, even if everything else did, and I had gotten good at pretending I was unbreakable until the doors at the end of the hallway opened and everything changed. It wasn't loud, not at first, just the soft hiss of automatic glass and the subtle shift in energy that made the hair on my arms stand up before I even looked up. You learn to read rooms when you work nights, you feel danger before you see it, and when I finally lifted my eyes I saw them, men in dark suits stepping into a place that smelled like antiseptic and second chances, moving like they didn't belong here and didn't care who noticed. And then I saw him, Vincent Russo. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew what he was. Power has a way of announcing itself without a single word. He wasn't the tallest man in the room, but everything seemed to move around him like gravity had chosen him specifically. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression calm, almost bored, but his eyes, they were the kind that didn't miss anything, sharp and quiet and cold in a way that made your chest tighten without knowing why. Conversations died mid-sentence. A doctor stopped walking mid-stride. Even the security guard near the elevator straightened like he just remembered how to stand properly, and I felt it too. That instinct to step back to make space, but my feet didn't move because Mrs. Langley in room 312 needed her medication and I had a chart in my hand and a job to do, so I looked down again, focused on the paper like it mattered more than the man who had just walked into my world, and for a second it worked until his voice cut through the silence, low, controlled, not raised, but somehow louder than anything else in the building. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, and no one answered, not immediately. Because no one wanted to be the one to step forward, not when something about him made it clear that whatever he wanted he expected to get. And then somehow his gaze found me across the distance like it had been searching for me specifically, and my breath caught just for a second, just long enough to feel it, that flicker of something unfamiliar, something I couldn't name yet, fear maybe, or something deeper, and I told myself not to react, not to let it show, because I had learned the hard way that showing fear only makes certain kinds of men look closer, and I couldn't afford that, not anymore, not with a child depending on me, not with a past I was still trying to outrun. So I straightened my shoulders, adjusted the hem of my scrubs, and took a step forward before I could change my mind, because sometimes the only way to survive a moment is to walk straight into it and pretend you belong there even when every instinct is telling you to run. And as I moved closer I felt his eyes on me, measuring, calculating, and I had the strangest thought that night that nothing in my life would be the same after this moment, not because of what he was about to say, but because of the way he was looking at me, like I was already part of a story I didn't remember choosing. I stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the fine detail in his suit, the kind of fabric that did not wrinkle, the kind that belonged in boardrooms, not emergency rooms, and I forced my voice to stay steady even though my pulse was climbing higher with every second. "I can help you find the charge nurse if you need something, sir." The word "sir" felt strange in my mouth, like I was acknowledging something I did not fully understand yet, but it bought me a second of control, and sometimes 1 second is everything. His eyes moved over me slowly, not in a way that felt careless, but in a way that felt deliberate, like he was reading a file only he could see, taking in my name badge, the slight tremor in my hand, the way my other hand hovered protectively near my stomach, and I hated how exposed that made me feel. Even though my scrubs were loose enough to hide most of it from strangers, but he was not looking like a stranger, he was looking like someone who noticed details other people missed. "You or knew," he said, and it was not a question. His voice was low, almost calm, but there was something underneath it, something sharp enough to make my shoulders tighten. "No, sir, I have been on this floor for 2 years," I replied, and I hated that I felt the need to explain myself to him, hated that my words came out softer than I intended, but I did not look away because looking away felt like losing, and I could not afford to lose anything tonight, not my job, not my composure, not the fragile sense of control I had built around my life. His gaze lingered for half a second longer and then shifted past me toward the hallway behind the nurse's station, where one of his men had already stepped forward, speaking quietly to a doctor whose face had gone pale. "There was a patient admitted here about an hour ago," Vincent continued, his tone still even but now focused, like the room had narrowed to a single point. "Male, late 30s, no identification. I want to know where he is." The way he said "want" made it sound like a guarantee, not a request, and I felt the tension ripple through the staff around me. Nurses pretending to check charts, doctors suddenly very interested in their pagers, everyone trying not to be the one who answered wrong. I swallowed and glanced briefly at the system on the computer screen behind me, because this was still my job and I still had a responsibility to the people under this roof, no matter who was standing in front of me. If the patient was admitted through emergency intake, I can check the system for you, but I will need a name or at least a condition, I said, carefully choosing each word like it mattered, because it did. His eyes returned to mine sharper this time, as if my answer had either impressed him or irritated him. I could not tell which. You ask a lot of questions, he said, and for a second the air between us felt heavier, like something invisible had shifted, and I felt it again, that instinct to step back to create distance, but my feet stayed where they were because stepping back would mean giving something away, and I did not even know what I would be giving up yet. It is part of my job, I replied, and my voice came out quieter than before but steadier, and that seemed to catch his attention in a different way because something in his expression changed, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like he had decided I was worth a second look, and that realization sent a chill down my spine. That had nothing to do with the cold air of the hospital. Then one of the men beside him leaned in, murmuring something under his breath, and I saw the faintest flicker of irritation cross Vincent's face before he straightened again, his attention snapping back to me like a switch. Then do your job, he said simply, and there it was, not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. And I turned toward the computer, my fingers moving over the keyboard faster than my thoughts, because routine was safer than standing still. Under his gaze, names scrolled across the screen, conditions, room numbers, details that suddenly felt more important than anything else in the world, and I focused on that, on the glow of the monitor, on the steady rhythm of typing, on anything except the presence I could feel behind me like a shadow that refused to move. And as I searched, I felt it again, that quiet certainty settling somewhere deep in my chest, that whatever he was looking for, whatever had brought him here tonight, it was not just about a patient anymore. And somehow, without understanding how, I had already stepped into the middle of it. I found the patient before I was ready for what it meant. The name field was blank, just like he said, but the intake notes were not empty. Male, approximately 38 years old, brought in unconscious, stabilized in emergency, and transferred to a private room under restricted access. And something about that phrase, restricted access, made my fingers pause on the keyboard, because that was not standard, not for someone without identification, not for someone who should have been just another case on a long night shift. I glanced over my shoulder without meaning to, and he was still there, exactly where I had left him, not impatient, not restless, just watching, like time moved differently for him. And for a second I forgot how to breathe. Room 417, I said finally, my voice quieter than before but clear enough to carry across the space between us, and I turned back toward him fully this time, because it felt wrong to speak to someone like him without facing them directly. His expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but I saw it, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his attention sharpened, like he had just been given confirmation of something important. One of the men beside him stepped forward immediately, already reaching for his phone, already moving like instructions had been given without words, and I felt it again, that ripple of tension spreading through the floor like a storm moving in slow motion. You did well, Vincent said, and the words should have sounded like approval, but they did not feel like it. They felt like a statement, like he was acknowledging a piece on a board that had just been placed exactly where he expected it to be, and something about that made my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the baby. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to ease the pressure on my lower back, the long hours catching up to me all at once, and his gaze dropped again, just for a second, not lingering, not inappropriate, just noticing, and that was somehow worse, because it meant nothing about me was invisible to him. You should sit, he said suddenly, and I blinked at him, surprised by the change in tone, not softer exactly, but different, like the edge had been pulled back just enough to reveal something else underneath. I am fine, I replied quickly, almost too quickly, because I did not want him to think I needed anything from him, not help, not concern, not attention. But the truth was, my feet were aching and my head felt heavier with every passing minute, and the fluorescent lights above us seemed a little too bright, a little too sharp. That was not a suggestion, he said, and there it was again, that quiet authority that made people listen even when they did not want to. And I felt a flicker of irritation rise in my chest, because I was not one of his men, I was not part of whatever world he controlled, and I refused to let him decide how I moved or where I stood. With respect, this is a hospital and I have responsibilities, I said, meeting his eyes again, and this time I did not look away, not even when the silence stretched, not even when I felt the weight of everyone else watching from a distance, pretending they were not listening, because something inside me refused to bend. Not now, not after everything I had already survived. And for a second something shifted between us, not anger, not exactly, but recognition, like he had just realized I was not as easy to move as he might have expected. And then, before either of us could say anything else, a sharp voice cut through the tension from the far end of the hallway, calling his name, not loudly but with enough urgency to change everything. And I saw it happen in real time, the way his focus snapped away from me, the way his entire presence redirected toward whatever had just interrupted us, and I let out a breath. I had not realized I was holding my hand, instinctively returning to my stomach, feeling that small steady movement again, grounding me, reminding me what mattered. And as he turned to walk away without another word, I should have felt relief. I should have felt like the moment had passed, like whatever strange gravity had pulled me into his orbit had finally released me. But instead I felt something else, something colder, something that settled deep in my chest like a warning, because the way he had looked at me, the way he had said, "You did well," it did not feel like the end of anything. It felt like the beginning of something I was not ready for. I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever tension had filled the hallway would dissolve the moment he disappeared around the corner, but hospitals have a way of holding on to things like echoes that do not fade as quickly as they should, and even after Vincent Russo walked away, the silence he left behind felt heavier than before, like the air had not decided how to move again. Yet I turned back to the computer, forcing my eyes to focus on the screen because routine was the only thing keeping me steady. Patient charts, medication schedules, vital signs, numbers that made sense, numbers that followed rules, unlike the man who had just shifted the entire floor without raising his voice. But my fingers hesitated over the keyboard because something in me was still listening, still aware of the subtle changes around me. Nurses whispering just a little too quietly, doctors avoiding eye contact, security suddenly standing a little straighter, like everyone had felt it and no one wanted to say it out loud. I swallowed and moved away from the station, picking up a chart just to give myself a reason to walk, because standing still felt like waiting, and I did not know what I would be waiting for. My steps carried me down the hallway past closed doors and soft monitor beeps, each sound grounding me again, reminding me that this was still my world, this was still where I belonged, not in whatever shadow he had brought with him. I paused outside room 312, checking the chart in my hand before stepping inside to check on Mrs. Langley, her breathing steady, her face relaxed in sleep, and for a moment everything felt normal again, the kind of normal that comes in small fragile pieces during night shifts. I adjusted her blanket, quietly checked her 4-line, and wrote a quick note on her chart, my movements automatic, practice safe, and I held onto that feeling a little longer than I needed to because it was easier than thinking about what had just happened. But as I stepped back into the hallway, the weight returned immediately, like stepping from one world into another, and I saw them again at the far end near the elevators, Vincent's men moving with quiet urgency, one speaking into a phone, another scanning the hallway like they were expecting something to happen, and my chest tightened without permission because I realized this was not finished, not even close. I turned slightly, intending to move in the opposite direction to put distance between myself and whatever was unfolding, but then I heard my name, not loud, not shouted, just spoken with quiet certainty behind me. Emily. I froze, every instinct telling me not to turn around because there was only one person on this floor who would say my name like that, like he already owned the right to it. Slowly I turned, and there he was again, closer this time, standing just a few steps away, his presence filling the space in a way that made everything else feel smaller, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on me with that same unsettling focus that made it impossible to pretend I was invisible. How do you know my name? I asked before I could stop myself, and my voice came out softer than I wanted, but steady enough to hold his gaze because I refused to let him see uncertainty even if I felt it. He did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make my pulse quicken before he spoke. You wear it right here, he said, nodding slightly toward my badge, and I felt a flicker of embarrassment at how obvious that should have been, but something in the way he said it told me that was not the only reason he knew, and that thought settled deeper than I wanted it to. Then his gaze shifted again, not away from me but lower, just for a second, and this time it lingered a fraction longer than before, not inappropriate, not invasive, just aware, and I instinctively placed my hand over my stomach, a protective reflex I could not stop even if I tried, and when I looked back at him, something in his expression had changed again, not softer, not kinder, but different, like a calculation had just been updated in his mind, and for the first time since he walked into my world I felt it clearly, the sense that whatever he was here for, whatever had brought him into this hospital, it had somehow become connected to me in a way I did not understand yet, and that realization sent a quiet chill through my chest because I knew one thing with absolute certainty: people like Vincent Russo did not notice you by accident. The way he looked at me made it impossible to pretend this was a normal conversation, like we were just two strangers passing time in a hallway under fluorescent lights, because nothing about him felt ordinary and nothing about this moment felt accidental. Is there something else you need? I asked, forcing my voice to stay level even as my fingers curled slightly against my palm, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because his presence had a way of pulling everything else out of focus, and I refused to let that happen. Not here, not where I still had control over something. He did not answer right away. Again, that silence stretching just enough to make me aware of every small detail: the quiet hum of machines down the hall, the distant sound of a cart rolling across tile, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space but enough to shift it enough that I could feel the difference, like the air itself had changed temperature. You should not be here tonight, he said, and the words did not sound like concern, they sounded like a conclusion already reached, and something in my chest tightened because I did not like the implication behind them. I did not like the idea that he thought he could decide where I belonged. This is my shift, I replied more firmly, this time lifting my chin just slightly because I needed that small act of defiance, even if it changed nothing. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. His eyes held mine for a long second, and I saw it again, that calculation, that quiet assessment, like he was weighing something invisible against something he already knew, and for a brief moment I wondered what version of me he was seeing, not the tired nurse, not the woman trying to build a life from the pieces she had left, but something Else something tied to whatever had brought him here, and that thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That depends on what you think this place is, he said finally, and his voice had lowered just enough that it felt like the words were meant only for me. Even though we were standing in the middle of a hallway that was anything but private, I felt a flicker of irritation rise again because I was tired of being spoken to like I was missing something, like there was a truth just out of reach that only he could see. It is a hospital, I said plainly. People come here to be treated, to be safe. The moment the word safe left my mouth, I knew it sounded fragile even to my own ears, because safety was not something you could guarantee, not in a place like this, not in a world where men like him could walk in and shift everything without permission. And something in his expression changed at that word, not amusement, not disbelief, just a subtle shift that made my stomach twist. Safe, he repeated quietly, like he was testing how it sounded, and then he shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. That is not what this is tonight. Before I could respond, before I could ask what he meant, one of his men approached quickly, stopping just short of us and leaning in to speak in a low voice that I could not fully hear, but I caught enough words to feel the tension spike again. Room 417, confirmed movement inside, no identification, still unclear, and I saw it happen again. That instant shift in Vincent, the way his entire focus redirected like a switch had been flipped, his posture straightening, his attention narrowing toward the direction of that room, like everything else had just become irrelevant, including me. He turned slightly as if to leave, and for a second I thought that was it, that whatever strange connection had formed between us would end as abruptly as it started. But then he paused just long enough to look back at me one more time, and there was something different in that look, something that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, like a decision had been made somewhere behind those eyes. Stay where you are, he said, and this time it did not sound like a suggestion at all. And before I could react, before I could even decide if I would listen, he was already walking away, his men falling into place around him, moving down the hallway with purpose toward room 417, leaving me standing there with the echo of his words settling heavily in my chest, because I knew without understanding how that whatever was about to happen behind the door was not going to stay behind it, and somehow without choosing it I had already become part of it. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, his words echoing in my mind like something that did not belong to him to decide where I stood or where I moved, and yet my feet did not follow the instinct to walk away, not immediately, because something deeper held me in place, something quieter but stronger than fear, curiosity mixed with a sense that leaving now would not actually remove me from whatever was unfolding, it would just make me blind to it, and I hated being blind more than I feared being close. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax as I glanced down the hallway toward room 417. The door was still closed, the overhead light steady, no alarms, no visible urgency, just silence, but it was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like a pause before something shifted. And I realized then that the hospital no longer felt like a place of routine, it felt like a stage where something unseen was already in motion, and I was standing too close to the center of it. I turned back toward the nurse's station, telling myself I needed to focus on my patients, that whatever business Vincent Russo had did not belong to me, did not involve me. But even as I picked up a chart, my attention refused to settle. The words blurred slightly on the page, not from exhaustion but from the awareness that lingered under my skin like a quiet pulse. I adjusted my stance again, easing the pressure in my lower back, and rested my hand briefly against my stomach, feeling that steady, reassuring movement, and I held onto it, grounding myself, reminding myself that I had a responsibility that came before anything else, before curiosity, before fear, before whatever strange gravity seemed to pull me back toward that hallway. And for a moment I almost convinced myself that I could ignore it, that I could let the night pass like any other shift. But then the elevator doors opened with a soft chime behind me, and something about the timing, about the way the sound cut through everything, made me turn without thinking. And when I did, I saw him, not Vincent, not one of his men, but someone else, stepping into the hallway with a presence that felt different, just as controlled but quieter, heavier in a way that did not demand attention yet commanded it anyway. He was dressed simply compared to the others, no sharp suit, no visible entourage, just a dark coat and steady eyes that scanned the floor once, taking everything in with a single glance before settling forward like he already knew where he was going. And I felt it immediately, that shift in the air again, not the same as before but just as undeniable, like something important had just entered the room. And for reasons I could not explain, my chest tightened as he started walking in the direction of room 417, the same room Vincent had just gone to, and something inside me clicked into place too quickly, too clearly, like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was holding. I did not know who he was, I did not know why he was here, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was not a coincidence. And as he passed me, his gaze flicked in my direction just for a second, not lingering, not questioning, just acknowledging, like he had already placed me somewhere in his understanding of the situation. And then he kept walking without hesitation toward the same door, the same moment, the same center of whatever was about to happen. And I felt my breath catch again, not from fear, not exactly, but from the quiet realization settling deep in my chest that whatever Vincent Russo had started, whatever tension had built from the moment he stepped into this hospital, it was about to collide with something else, something just as controlled, just as powerful, and somehow without choosing it I was still standing close enough to feel the impact before anyone else. The moment he reached the door, everything seemed to slow down, not in a dramatic way, but in that subtle shift where every sound becomes sharper, every movement more deliberate, like the world is paying attention to a single point, and I found myself taking a step forward before I realized I was moving, not close enough to interfere, not close enough to be noticed, just enough that I could see the outline of what was happening without being part of it. The man in the dark coat did not hesitate when he approached room 417. He did not knock, he simply pushed the door open and stepped inside like he already belonged there, and something about that sent a quiet tension through my chest, because even Vincent's men had paused outside that door moments earlier, like there were lines that should not be crossed without permission, but this man did not seem to recognize those lines, or maybe he just did not care. I could not see everything from where I stood, but I could see enough. Vincent was inside, standing near the foot of the bed, his posture controlled, his attention fixed on something I could not fully make out from this distance, and for a second neither of them spoke. The silence stretched long enough that it felt intentional, like two forces measuring each other without words. And then Vincent turned slightly, his gaze locking onto the man who had just entered, and even from across the hallway I felt it, that shift in him, the subtle change that made everything about him sharper, more alert, like something unexpected had just walked into his carefully controlled situation. And the man in the coat stopped just inside the doorway, his presence quiet but unyielding, and when he spoke his voice carried just enough through the open space for me to hear a single word. Vincent, not raised, not demanding, just certain, like a name that did not need to be explained. And I saw it happen, the smallest reaction in Vincent, not fear, not exactly, but recognition, the kind that changes the direction of a moment without anyone else noticing. And I felt my breath catch, because I had seen how people reacted to Vincent Russo, I had seen the way rooms shifted around him, but this was different. This was the first time I had seen him pause, like the balance of control had just adjusted in a way he had not planned for. I should have looked away, I should have stepped back and returned to my station like none of this concerned me, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor, my attention locked on that doorway, because something about this moment felt important in a way I could not explain. And then the man in the coat moved slightly further into the room, enough that the light caught his face more clearly, and something in my chest tightened again, not from fear, not from tension, but from recognition that came too fast, too sharp to ignore, because I knew that face, I knew it in a way that did not make sense until my mind caught up with what my instincts had already realized. Daniel, my brother's name, formed silently in my thoughts before I could stop it, and for a second everything else disappeared. The hallway, the hospital, the quiet hum of machines replaced by the sudden rush of memory and disbelief, because Daniel Carter was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to walk into rooms like that. He was not supposed to stand across from a man like Vincent Russo, like they were equals, like they existed in the same world. And yet there he was, steady, composed, looking at Vincent with a calm that felt heavier than anything else in that room. And I felt my heart start to pound, not from fear but from the realization crashing into me all at once that whatever line I thought separated my life from whatever world Vincent came from, it had already been crossed long before tonight, and I just had not seen it until now. For a second I forgot how to move, how to think, how to breathe, because nothing in my life had prepared me for this moment. Not the long nights studying, not the quiet years trying to rebuild something stable, not even the silence my brother had left behind when he disappeared from my world without explanation 2 years ago. And yet there he was, standing inside that room like he had never left, like he had always belonged in places like this, facing a man like Vincent Russo without hesitation, without fear. And something inside me cracked, not loudly, not visibly, just enough to make everything feel unsteady, like the ground beneath me had shifted and I had not caught up yet. I took another step forward before I could stop myself, my hand instinctively pressing against my stomach as if I needed to anchor myself to something real, because this could not be real. Not Daniel, not here, not like this. And then he turned his head slightly, just enough that his profile caught the light, and there was no doubt anymore, it was him. The same sharp lines, the same steady gaze, the same quiet presence that had always made me feel safe growing up, except now there was something else layered over it, something harder, something that did not belong to the brother I remembered. And I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but the realization that I did not know him the way I thought I did. Inside the room Vincent had gone still, not frozen, not weak, just still, in a way that felt deliberate, like he was recalculating something that no longer fit his expectations. And when he spoke his voice was lower than before, controlled but edged with something I had not heard from him yet. "You were not expected here," he said, and the words carried across the hallway just enough for me to catch them. And Daniel did not react immediately. He did not step forward, he did not raise his voice, he simply stood there meeting Vincent's gaze like time was not a factor, like this moment would unfold exactly how he intended it to, regardless of who else was involved. "You should not be here at all," Daniel replied, and his voice was calm, steady, the same tone he used to use when I was a kid and scared of thunderstorms, except now it carried something heavier, something that made the air feel tighter just hearing it, and I realized then that this was not a coincidence, this was not an unexpected meeting, this was something deeper, something that had been building long before tonight, and I had just stepped into it without knowing. Vincent's expression shifted again, not dramatically but enough that I could see the difference from where I stood, the control still there, the composure intact, but beneath it something sharper, something more cautious, and for the first time since he walked into this hospital he looked like a man who had just encountered something he could not immediately control, and that realization sent a quiet chill through me because I had seen what control looked like on him, I had felt it directed at me, and now I was watching it adjust in real time in response to my brother, and that did not make me feel safer, it made me feel like I had just uncovered a truth I was never meant to see. I should have walked away, I should have turned back to my station and pretended none of this was happening, but my feet would not listen because every instinct I had was telling me that this moment mattered, that whatever was being said in that room, whatever history existed between those two men, it was about to change something in my life whether I wanted it to or not. And as I stood there caught between the world I thought I understood and the one unfolding in front of me, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. This was not just about Vincent Russo anymore, and it was not just about my brother either. It was about the space between them, the tension that filled it, the unspoken history that neither of them needed to explain, and somehow without asking, without choosing, I was standing right in the middle of it. I did not realize I had moved until I was standing just outside the doorway, my hand still pressed lightly against my stomach like it could steady everything that was unraveling inside me, because hearing my brother's voice again after 2 years should have felt like relief, it should have felt like safety, but instead it felt like stepping into a truth I was not prepared to face. Vincent noticed me first. I saw it in the way his gaze shifted past Daniel for just a fraction of a second, landing on me with that same sharp awareness, but this time there was something else layered into it, something heavier, something that looked almost like realization, and that was the moment Daniel turned, following that shift like he had felt it without needing to see it, and when his eyes found mine the world narrowed to a single point. Emily, he said, and it was different from how Vincent had said it earlier. There was no calculation, no distance, just my name spoken, like it still belonged to him, like I was still part of the life he had left behind, and my chest tightened so quickly it hurt because I did not know which version of him I was looking at anymore, the brother who used to walk me home after school, or the man who stood in front of Vincent Russo like they shared something I could not understand. You should not be here, he added quietly, and the words echoed what Vincent had said earlier, but they felt different coming from him, not like control, not like authority, but like a warning, and that only made it worse because Daniel had never warned me about anything before. He had always shielded me from it, and now he was standing here telling me to step away without explaining why I work here. I said, my voice unsteady for the first time that night, because this was no longer just about standing my ground, this was about understanding how my life had split into two versions without me noticing. You disappeared. The words slipped out before I could stop them, softer than I intended but heavy enough to carry the weight of everything I had not said for 2 years, and I saw it in his face, the smallest shift, the briefest flicker of something that looked like regret before it was gone, replaced by that same controlled calm that made him feel like a stranger. Vincent did not interrupt, he did not step forward, he simply watched the exchange with that same intense focus, like he was seeing pieces of a puzzle come together in real time, and for the first time since I met him I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It felt like being seen too clearly, like he now understood something about me that I had not even fully understood myself. This is not the place for this conversation, Daniel said finally, his voice steady again but firmer this time, and I realized he was not just speaking to me, he was speaking into the space between all of us, to Vincent, to whatever situation had brought them here, to the tension that had not yet resolved. And Vincent tilted his head slightly, considering him for a moment before his gaze returned to me one last time, and there was something in it now, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not control, but recognition, like he had just connected me to a world I had spent my life trying to stay away from. You should listen to him, Vincent said quietly, and the words landed heavier than I expected because they were not a command, not this time. They sounded almost like advice, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because men like him did not give advice, they gave orders, and the fact that he was not doing that now meant something had changed, something I did not yet understand. And as I stood there caught between them, between the brother I thought I knew and the man who had just altered everything around me, I realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that the life I had been holding on to, the simple version of it, the safe version, it was already gone, and the only question left was whether I would keep pretending I could go back to it or finally accept that some moments do not ask for permission before they change you forever.